Heyo and welcome back to Wonderlands gamers. In today's video I have two new legendaries that just released from the DLC Coiled Captors last night that are pretty nuts for any character and majority of builds. The first one's actually a spell called the Tidebreaker, which casts similar to the eruption spells, but this one sends a wave along the ground, knocking back enemies and actually doing a decent amount of damage. 1200 base damage for a spell is definitely up there at level 40, particularly seeing as this is not a chaotic, volatile, or a primordial, if that's how you pronounce those. But the spell's gimmick or unique ability is definitely the main focus. Enemies hit by it are soaked, which, great term. Soaked enemies take additional damage from lightning and frost, but less from fire damage, logically. Now don't get too excited, it says 150% bonus damage there. That's not true. I don't know if it's a bug whether or not it's not doing 150% damage, or if it's a bug that they accidentally put a 1 in front of the 50, because 150 would be stupidly high. So I don't know, either way. In game, I did test it. It's about 50%. It's actually slightly higher than that, but it's around about 50, which for the record is still a huge amount of damage, by the way. It's only really being rivaled by the Buffmeister right now. So that's where the spell's currently at, which will come back to the Buffmeister, by the way. But the Tidebreaker can roll with up to 3 spell charges, which is kind of huge. I actually managed to get it on my literally second roll, which is really, really good. Also, a huge bonus of these things, the cooldown is really low as well. Like the 3 charge one I have is 18 seconds. The single charge basic legendary one I have is 12 seconds, which is up there with the fastest cooldown spells in the game. And if you get a chaotic, volatile, or a primordial, I keep forgetting that, version of them, it'll just go down from there, which for reference, if you don't really know spell cooldown times, the Buffmeister, the best one I have, is still over 30 seconds. Now, one other thing I did test for you guys, on my single charge one, I did get a crit chance and crit damage roll. It unfortunately doesn't boost your critical hit damage. I was hoping that was going to be a thing. Instead, the crit chance at the top of the card there does go up slightly from like 5 to 13%. So I assume the wave itself will do an increased critical hit damage if you get it to actually hit a crit, which is good because the spell itself does do a decent amount of damage. But unfortunately, whether or not you have this thing equipped, whether or not the enemy has a debuff, you don't actually change the amount of crit hit damage you're doing from your gun from debuffing them from the spell. Unfortunately, I did try. Our second legendary today is actually a class mod, which you can use to either replace the spell or pair with the spell, depending on what kind of build setup you have going, because you could use these in multiple different ways. Regardless, it's called the Cape of Tides. It can come with multiple different prefixes and suffixes, and of course, can roll for all characters. Now, its unique ability, critical hits have a 25% chance to proc a Water Nova that applies the same soaked effect to nearby enemies, which is kind of insane. 25% chance on a critical hit. Pretty much any character is hitting a lot of critical hits in this game, regardless of whether you're accurate, because there's so many critical hit chance buffs in the game. And then if you're, for instance, Stabbermancer, whose whole action skill is hitting critical hits, you're getting a lot of Water Novas, and you're hitting all of these debuffs on pretty much every enemy, which is kind of nuts. It also supposedly increased all soaked effects by 57%. Currently, that is bugged. I tried them on, I tested it on everything. The spell itself lasts for 10 seconds if you don't have the class mod equipped, and you debuff the enemy, it'll last for 10 seconds. You can also see it because they have like a little effect over them. The class mod by itself with no spell equipped lasts 8 seconds, and with them combined, it just lasts the 10 seconds of the spell. So currently the 57% doesn't work, so hopefully they fix that soon. Now, if you think like me, you might be asking, do they stack? Do you get both abilities? Can you proc them both at the same time? Do you get 300% bonus damage? And now we know it's 100% bonus damage. Unfortunately not. I don't know if that's intended game design or if it's bugged, because, you know, clearly other things here are bugged. So the main benefit of stacking them both together is being able to debuff all the enemies from multiple different ways, because, you know, Sabo has really easy crits, and Spellshot has a really easy spell cooldown, but not a lot of the characters have that. So pairing them the two together means all the enemies will be debuffed from both your spells and critical hits, and you won't ever really have downtime of the buff, which, by the way, can we appreciate a class mod that has that much damage as a passive with no real downturn? Like, the only negative is the fire damage, but how many enemies are you really using fire damage? What endgame items are doing that much fire damage you're currently using? Majority of weapons are cryo right now, because most enemies are affected by cryo. I tested this in-game with my Stabbo Cross Spore Warden gun build, by the way, on Chaos 20 with a liquid cooling, because I figured most people would know what that gameplay looked like, and the effect is really, really good. You pretty much have that debuff up all the time. It does have a slight cooldown. Not that I think it's ever stopped me from actually applying the debuff to anybody, it's just to stop the Nova spam. Like, if you're in From the Shadows with a multi-pellet shotgun, you don't want 25 Novas going off at the same time. Your game and PC or console will just crash. In this build, just because you hit so many critical hits, I think pairing it with the class mod and an elemental Buffmeister relevant to the enemies you're fighting generally will put out more damage, just because you don't really need the spell to add more debuff. pretty much everything is always debuffed anyway. But in saying that, the spell is a really great second option depending on your build. Like, a lot of builds depend on different class mod passives, like Deathless builds or Dark Magic Conversion. Passive is a really good class mod as well. So if you want your class mod to be that passive instead, you can chuck on the spell instead. And I know not everybody wants to use a Buffmeister as well, so this is a good second option. Also for the spell shots, I know the Buffmeister Zerking trick got a little bit of an adjustment yesterday. So a spell combo I'm keen to try out just to see how dumb it is having both the Tidebreaker and the Buffmeister for double the buff and double the damage. Now, if you guys would like to get your hands on either of these items, you will need the Coiled Captors DLC, like I said, and Chums, aka the Old God, aka the Shark Guy, at the end of DLC 1 can be farmed for either of them. And if you didn't know, you can actually farm him the same as you can Zom Boss. If you just take them out at the end of the dungeon run, but before you go through the portal that finishes the run, just down yourself in the arena. You'll spawn back up at the top. You won't fail the run. And you can just drop back in, the boss will respawn, and you can just farm on a loop like that. So make sure when you go to do DLC 1, you take along a weapon like a Torgue Sticky, or a TD or Chuck that does damage to you, anything like that, and just down yourself and farm on a loop like that. It'll save you doing the whole run every single time. Alternatively, you can try your luck at the loot bunnies at the end of the Chaos Chamber. Once you've completed the DLC in its entirety, the loot actually moves over to the Chaos Chamber as well. All of the rooms, the boss itself, and then the loot pool will be added to the bunnies as well once you complete DLC 1. If you guys enjoyed, feel free to subscribe down below. It is totally free and much appreciated. Other than that, we have a Twitch we stream to pretty much every night just after we post the videos, and we also have a Discord community. Both are linked down below if you guys are interested. And other than that, I hope you guys have a fantastic day. Until next time, adios.